Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today, talking about some men of the Lord Jesus Christ. Obviously, we had our episode on Jesus Christ at Easter week of last year, and now we're talking about some people who were like, yeah, man, I'm going to take what that dude said, and I'm going to make it my entire personality. Literally. And, you know, look, here's the thing. I think there are a lot of preachers out there who are genuinely good people. And they want to, at the very least, use that, you know, theology and ideology and moral compass as a way to comfort people, as a way to help people find happiness and love and peace and all that. And I think that's great. But as with everything, literally everything, there are also some bad apples who just ruin it. Like, I don't know, most of the Catholic Church, a lot of very, 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 very fundamental, very, very highly conservative sects of Baptists and Mormons and places like as much as I make fun of Mormons, like the broad majority of them are genuinely like really good people, super happy people, but there's just a huge percentage of them also that are creepy and weird. And like, I don't think we're talking about any of the Mormons in this episode. We are talking about like Catholics and Protestants and things of that nature. And, you know, I've talked a lot before about my upbringing, raised in a very evangelical environment, you know, and so I connect to this episode in a lot of ways. I've known some good preachers in my life, and I've also known some questionable ones. And so this episode's got just some fun people. All right. We have 4 preachers from history. Again, kind of like I mentioned last week, like we're not talking about Jim Bakker or, you know, Joel Osteen or any of these like mega church pastors who maybe have gotten convicted of like some fraud or diddling kids or anything like that. Like that's big news. All right. A lot of people know these stories. A lot of people, most people don't know these stories. And we're looking at the lives of Harold Davidson, George Went Hensley, Melvyn Nurse, and our first story will be of Hans Schmidt.
Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time.
I don't know about you, but I feel like in that intro, I started like 8 different thoughts and did not go anywhere with any of them. And ultimately said a lot, but then also said nothing at all. And it just be like that sometimes when you're a podcaster. Anyway, Hans Schmidt was born in 1881 in Bavaria, Germany, to a Protestant father and a Catholic mother, which had to make for some very lively family gatherings around that time. To make things better, both sides of his family had a long history of mental illness, and Schmidt was regularly beaten by his Protestant father when he wasn't busy beating his Catholic mother. Schmidt understandably coped by exploring his sexuality and also dismembering animals and drinking their blood. So, like we've seen this a lot, you know, a kid grows up in an abusive household, copes by just being terrible to animals or doing stuff with his wiener that's probably a little questionable. And what a surprise. At least he takes this route of attending seminary to become a priest but he was arrested in 1905 on charges of forging diplomas for failing students, I guess also at the seminary. However, Schmidt avoided prison after his father then hired a lawyer to get the charges dropped because of Schmidt's diagnosed mental illness. Despite no one having any faith in his mental and moral fitness to be a priest, Schmidt was ultimately ordained by Bishop Kirstein of Mainz. However, Schmidt would later claim that his quote-unquote real ordination came one night when he was visited by Saint Elizabeth, patron saint of, among other things, dying children, bakers, the homeless, and the falsely accused. And that's weird because, like, what's crazy is he becomes ordained as a Catholic priest, right? And his father, being a Protestant, hired a lawyer to help him fend off criminal charges so that he could be ordained as a Catholic priest. So I don't know, maybe his dad wasn't like super Protestant, like didn't really care, but just interesting to note altogether. Also, the patron saints in Catholicism have always fascinated me because you have these people who allegedly did a miracle. It's pretty sketchy, evidence, but then they become the patron saint of all of these things, right? And it's like everything, like the patron saint of waffles and the patron saint of diarrhea and the patron saint, and I don't know if those are true. They might be, honestly. Like there's probably like a patron saint of stomach illness and it's diarrhea, basically. But like Saint Elizabeth visited him in a dream one night and, probably, whatever, but she's the patron saint of dying children, but also bakers. Like, what is the connection there? With the patron saint of the homeless, but also the falsely accused. And that one's the key right there. That's the one he's latching onto because he was falsely accused of because of his mental illness, that he was forging these diplomas, whatever. Anyway, as a priest, of course, Schmidt wasted no time molesting the altar boys during his time in the villages of Bergel and Seligenstadt in Germany, almost as if that's like the standard operating procedure of being a priest. He also had several affairs with prostitutes and other women at the church, but eventually enough people complained about the weird way that he conducted himself in the Sunday masses that he ran, that he realized that he was not going to receive another church assignment in Europe. Like he's been found out for molesting too many people. He's been transferred to too many churches. And he's like, all right, well, I guess I'm not going to get anywhere else in Europe. So rather than quit, he immigrated to the United States in 1909, where he was assigned to a church in Louisville, Kentucky, before eventually settling in New York City. In 1912, Schmidt met Anna Aumuller, the housekeeper of the rectory of St. Boniface's Church. He immediately heard a voice from God ordering him to love Aumuller, who, initially refused his advances before eventually giving in and having a secret sexual relationship with him. Hot. Nun, or not even a nun, but a housekeeper of the rectory and the priest. Forbidden love. Anyway, I don't know what I'm doing. By the time though Aumuller came around to being like, okay, Mr. Priest, you can enter my forbidden chambers or whatever. I don't know. By the time she got to that point, Schmidt was already having a homosexual relationship with dentist Ernest Murit, who he enjoyed more than being with a woman. Go figure. When his relationship with Ernest Murit was discovered by church officials, Schmidt was then transferred to another church in New York City, but he also continued his relationship with Anna Aumuller. And one night, while the two were getting it on at the altar of St. Joseph's Church, literally banging this chick at the altar of a church, metal, Schmidt apparently heard another voice from God commanding him to sacrifice her. And what better time to hear a voice from God when you are balls deep into some lady on the altar itself? That's exactly where you're going to sacrifice her. And Aumuller, rightfully, told Schmidt that he was crazy and that God definitely was not talking to him.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Trying Our Quest, a D&D actual play podcast hosted by some of New York's most on this podcast improvisers and comedians.
Join Lucy, Rex, Janice, and Patch as they explore the mythological world of Elspar.
Fight monsters, titans, and men.
And learn how to get along with each other in this fantastical adventure.
Join us every Wednesday as we continue trying our quest.
And to make things worse, she also decided that now was the right time to tell him that she was pregnant with his baby. And that's nuts, right? Like, you're letting this priest bang you on the altar of this church. And the priest is like, hey, so guess what? God, I just heard from God in my head, right? I'm not crazy. But God told me, he's talking to me in my head. He says, I need to sacrifice you. And I mean, we're already here. Like, here's the altar. Let's go ahead and do this. And Amular's like, wait a minute. No. First of all, no. That's not what happened. Also, I'm pregnant with your baby. Ha! Surprise. Anyway, so that was enough, apparently, to get Schmidt to reconsider maybe that God wasn't talking to him and maybe that he was actually crazy. Well, on September 2nd, 1913, Schmidt arrived at the apartment that he and Amular rented together while posing as a married couple, and he slashed Amular's throat while she slept, and then drank her blood, and then raped her as she bled to death. Okay, because God probably said so. Once everything was done, Schmidt dismembered her body, boarded a ferry, and then tossed the pieces into the Hudson River, which is crazy that he's just like on this ferry and he's just chucking body parts out. He's probably got them in like bags or something where it's not obvious, but like that would probably still get some attention, just some crazy looking dude throwing bags over the river, or maybe not. I don't know. It's 1913. Pollution, littering, probably not a big of a deal back then. And then, as if none of this had actually happened, he then made his way back to St. Joseph's Church and performed Mass and Holy Communion for his congregation. When Amular's body parts began washing ashore in Weehawken, New Jersey, police opened an investigation. And then, crazy how they did this, but by using a price tag that was still attached to a pillowcase that he had been using to dump parts of Amular's body, police followed the paper trail from the price tag on this pillowcase to the pillow factory in Newark, to a furniture dealer in Manhattan, to the receipt records of every pillowcase purchase that had been made at that store, I guess ever. And then police found a record from August 26, 1913 to have a delivery to 68 Bradhurst Avenue. And after a 3-day stakeout and not seeing anyone, police finally broke into that apartment to find dried blood on the walls and a bloody knife on the shelf. I assume they had like checked out all the other ones, and this was like one of the remaining ones that they hadn't, figured out yet, but it's crazy. After finding several letters identifying Schmidt and Amular as like being the ones who owned that apartment, police showed up at St. Joseph's Church and found Schmidt asleep in the church's parlor. Upon waking up, Schmidt immediately confessed to the murder and described the entire ordeal in way more detail than anyone was actually comfortable with. But after the initial trial ended in a hung jury, Schmidt was finally convicted of first-degree murder and was executed in the electric chair on February 18th, 1916. Moving on now to Harold Davidson, who was born on July 14th, 1875 in Sholing, a poor suburb of Southampton, England. At least 27 members of Davidson's family were part of the Anglican clergy, and his father, Francis, was the pastor at a small church. Since practically everyone else worked in the church, Davidson's family assumed that he would end up doing the same thing and actually raised him in preparation for such a life. Davidson, however, he had other plans because he wanted to become, of all things, a comedian. And it's crazy to think that like someone, like a comedian in the late 1800s was a thing. And it's probably like something way different than, obviously, you hear comedian, you probably think like a stand-up comedian. I don't know what a comedian would have been in the late 1800s. I can't even imagine what kind of jokes. I just don't imagine humor being a thing until like the 1960s when drugs became mainstream and people laughed. Like I just don't see. You never hear about people laughing until like the 1960s. Mark Twain famously kind of considered a humorist, and there were other kind of satirists and other things like other writers like that. But like their stuff wasn't like super funny, you know? I don't know. Okay. But anyway, Davidson, he wanted to be a comedian. And while he spent time in London performing various comedic routines on stage, he continued living a religious life, completely abstaining from alcohol and also giving Bible readings to elderly people around the city. Despite that, his parents still weren't happy that he wasn't fully devoted to the church, and eventually just like through passive aggressive comments and disappointed looks that parents give, like they eventually wore him down. And so in 1898, Davidson was admitted to Exeter College thanks mostly to influential family connections, even though he was wildly unqualified to attend this college. He immediately struggled with his courses and all of that and dropped out after 3 years. He then transferred to Grindals Hall, which was this prep school, and obtained his degree in 1903. Despite still being extremely unqualified to be part of the clergy, Davidson was ordained by the Bishop of Oxford later that year. After bouncing around a couple of churches, Davidson settled in the parish of Stiffkey in Norfolk. He got married, had kids, and actually, developed close relationships with the villagers who referred to him as Little Jimmy because he was only 5'3". I don't know where Jimmy comes from, Harold, but whatever. Davidson also continued to stay close to the theater world, where he would minister to showgirls, chaperone dancers to shows in Paris, and house out-of-work actresses at his rectory in Stiffkey. Because most of the rural farm folk didn't like the liberal acting types hanging around the rectory, Davidson's reputation around Stiffkey began to go south. When World War I began, he ran off to join the Royal Navy as a chaplain. He was stationed on the HMS Fox in the Middle East, where he was actually arrested by naval police after being found at a Cairo brothel. Now, Davidson explained that he had simply been looking for a diseased prostitute that had been infecting the men on his ship, and that he actually wasn't trying to find a lady for himself, which is weird. Like, it's a weird thing to do. Why do you care so much about trying to find the source of the crabs and the gonorrhea? Like, I mean, maybe you're going to try to minister and maybe thought he was going to try to preach to her and get her to turn her life around, maybe, and all that. I don't know. But it is a weird thing to do. And especially when everyone else on that ship is trying to get some poontang, for him to be like, no, I was just trying to go find this woman who's giving everybody the clap and want to talk to her. I just want to talk to her. Look at this. Anyway, how is she so good at sex, but also so dirty, other than it being early 1900s Africa? Anyway, charges were dropped, and Davidson was then transferred to another ship before leaving the Navy in 1919. Following his discharge, Davidson returned home to find that his wife, Molly, was 6 months pregnant, which was problematic because Davidson had definitely not been home in more than a year. And although he was upset that his wife had cheated on him, Davidson actually accepted the child as his own and then returned to his former routine of spending time around the theater scene in London. He soon became convinced that every single young girl in London needed to be rescued from rampant drugs and prostitution. And I'm sure there was some of that going around. But was it all of the girls? No. But whatever. He would then befriend various young girls, give them money and an opportunity to work at the rectory, and generally care for them whenever they did catch an STD. And again, that's a little weird. All right. And I get it. Because he's Jesus famously would have hung out with prostitutes and all of that. And we get it. But I don't know, man. He just didn't really explain himself a whole lot. And so has this issue, this incident with this prostitute in Egypt. Now he's just befriending various young girls, teenage, young adult girls, giving them money, giving them a place to work, letting them stay at the rectory. On the outside, if you're not really aware of it, looks really weird. And over the course of the next 12 years, Davidson would approach, and that's weird, he would approach as many as 200 girls every year. He then began calling himself the prostitute's padre and spent time talking to girls and doing whatever he could to actually help them get by. I think the best of intentions, just poor execution. Most of them because of the way he went about it, found him creepy and actually had him banned from various restaurants and coffee shops that he frequented around London. Now, of course, this sort of charitable work was very expensive, and his rectory salary was not enough to recover it, or to cover, all of the extra help he was giving out. In an attempt to increase his income, Davidson began working with Arthur John Gordon, who swindled him into investing in terrible business ideas. By 1925, Davidson was completely broke, failed to pay his local taxes, and then filed for bankruptcy. Back in Stiff Key, where his church was, Davidson's congregation had become more and more divided over his work in London. Major Philip Hammond, the church warden at nearby Morston, felt that Davidson was neglecting his duties at Stiff Key and believed that he was doing a little more than just mentoring those prostitutes. He's banging them. You get it. In 1931, after several disagreements, Hammond made a formal complaint to the Bishop of Norwich over Davidson's behavior with the prostitutes in London, and somehow this complaint turned into a full-blown court case. The prosecuting attorney, Henry Dashwood, quickly found Rose Ellis, one of the prostitutes in London, and coerced her into signing a document detailing her 10-year relationship with Davidson. Although it was never presented in court, the document never actually contained any punishable acts, only that Ellis had lanced a boil off of Davidson's butt at one point. So, who's taking care of who at this point? As time went on, the public started hearing about this alleged scandal and got super interested in it, which ultimately drove the church to proceed with, kind of carrying on with this case. Davidson's trial began on March 29th, 1932, with Davidson being accused of, quote-unquote, associating with women of loose character and, quote-unquote, accosting, molesting, and importuning young females for immoral purposes. I just say, annoying young girls into seeing them naked or something. I don't know. The primary witness was 17-year-old Barbara Harris, who claimed that Davidson had mistaken her for a famous actress before developing a relationship with her, where he regularly visited her, gave her small amounts of money, and promised to find her work. The horror. Oh, what a dick. She claimed that the two often shared a room, though Davidson at first slept in a chair before eventually actually climbing into bed with her. So that's a little scandalous. Harris also alleged that when she rejected Davidson's sexual advances, he would instead, quote unquote, relieve himself nearby. So we got kind of a Louis C.K. situation going on where he's just spanking his monkey in front of, but she's also a prostitute, so she can't be that weirded out by it and expects something I don't know. Anyway, Harris also claimed that Davidson had taken her back to Stiff Key to work as an unpaid maid, where he promised to divorce his wife and marry her instead. Davidson also allegedly made her and another girl dance in a nightgown in front of him so he could judge their dancing abilities. When David took the stand, his theater background all of a sudden took over, resulting in a testimony that actually felt more like a comedy routine than a court appearance, which is not the right move when you're a pastor being accused of sleeping with hundreds of prostitutes. Again, the execution on this guy, intention may have been the best, but the execution, time and a place, man, just didn't have it. When he was asked about the boil that got lanced off of his butt, he claimed to have no idea what a buttock was. He's like, I don't know what a buttock is. You mean my booty? That's probably not a direct quote, but you get it, right? Despite that, the evidence against Davidson overall seemed pretty inconclusive, and it seemed like he was going to get off the charges, not get off on all the prostitutes. Anyway, can't help it. Then, however, the prosecution presented a photograph of Davidson with Estelle Douglas, the 15-year-old daughter of one of his friends, who was also mostly naked and separated from Davidson only by a thin shawl. Davidson claimed that the photo was a publicity shot to help her find work, and that she actually had no idea that she was naked behind the shawl, which is it's weird. So this photograph apparently is him standing next to this 16-year-old or 15-year-old girl who is mostly naked, but there's just this thin sheet between the two of them. Why is he even in the picture to begin with? I don't know. Maybe for scale, or I don't know. But again, on July 8th, Davidson was found guilty on 5 counts of immorality. Great that that's not like a criminal charge in today's world. Oh my goodness. Would that, I mean, and maybe it's, by different names now, but God, just imagine how many people would be put in jail for immorality. Anyway, while he awaited sentencing, Davidson tried to make some more money by returning to theater, but churches would actually pressure the various stage companies to refuse to hire him. And with no other option, he then turned to public performances and found a place on Blackpool's Golden Mile beachfront where he performed alongside Mariana the Gorilla Girl, the bearded lady from Russia, and Dick Harrow, the world's fattest man. Okay. Davidson's preaching license was also revoked. And when he returned to Morstan to demand the keys to his church, Major Hammond literally turned Davidson around and kicked him off the church property. Hammond was later fined for assault. A few days later, Davidson was defrocked, and while he awaited the results of his appeal to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Davidson then returned to Blackpool to continue his performances in order to make money to now pay his very massive legal bills. While he normally performed a one-man show in a barrel, he also froze himself in a refrigerated chamber and then roasted himself in a glass oven while a mechanized devil poked him with a pitchfork. Like comedy. Although the performances were fairly successful, Davidson continued to face legal trouble. He was given a 9-day jail sentence for failing to pay one of his former landladies. He was also arrested following his freezing routine for attempted suicide, though charges were dropped and he was later awarded £382 in damages for false imprisonment. In 1937, Davidson joined Fred Rye's Animal Show, which was problematic because Davidson had an irrational fear of animals. So, why would you do that? Despite that, Davidson performed for crowds by getting into a cage with 2 lions as kind of like this Daniel in a lion's den sort of thing. Unsurprisingly, it did not go well. On July 28th, after Davidson cracked his whip as part of the performance, one of the lions grabbed Davidson by the neck and began running around the cage. He died 2 days later from his injuries. Thanks to World War II, Davidson's story quickly faded from British thought, but today, most people don't believe that Davidson did anything explicitly immoral. Again, he's just like a weird dude. Those weird, super out there theater dudes and super flowy, showy theater dudes. And again, just poor execution, best of intentions, but really bad execution. Next story here is of George Went Hensley, who was born on May 2nd, 1881 in Scott County, Virginia, though he would later tell his children that he was born in West Virginia and raised in Pennsylvania. I don't know why the discrepancy there. Hensley was one of 13 children and grew up in Tennessee. And while visiting family in Big Stone Gap, Virginia in the 1890s, Hensley saw an elderly woman handle a snake during a revival service at a coal mining camp and thought that it was the coolest thing he'd ever seen. And again, snake handling is one of those Southern things. And, we'll get into this, as more of the story goes, but just a weird sect of Christianity. By 1901, however, Hensley had left the Baptist church and was searching for his own life's purpose. He married Amanda Winiger later that year and moved into a shack on her brother's property in Ooltewah, Tennessee. While there, Hensley worked in local mines, helped his brother-in-law's lumber business, and made moonshine. One day, while attending a Pentecostal service, Henry reconverted back to Christianity and immediately swore off all alcohol and tobacco. Although he initially followed all of the Pentecostal's rules for being a good Christian, Hensley began to question whether or not he was living the most religious life he could, and he also got super fixated on a very specific passage, Mark 16, 17, and 18. Chapter 16, verse 17 and 18. And for reference, that is, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." And Hensley took all of that extremely literally. And he then, at that point, understood why that old woman he watched as a kid hadn't been hurt while handling the snake, because it's literally right there in the Bible that they shall take up serpents. And at the same time, Hensley also kind of began to doubt his newfound salvation. So he took a hike out to a nearby hill to pray and ask for God's guidance. And along the way, as he's hiking up this hill, he encountered a snake, which is common. A lot of snakes up in the woods, in the forest. And without thinking, he grabbed it like he's some hillbilly Steve Irwin. And when the snake didn't fight back or bite him, probably just like wriggling, freaking out, whatever, Hensley believed that that was a sign from God confirming his salvation. Okay. And then he ran back down to his church with the snake still in hand and began challenging everyone to prove their own salvation by holding it. And that's a dangerous type of Christianity. You know, it's that whole, like, I grew up in the Left Behind era where like the Left Behind, movies came out. And there was like one of the biggest wet dreams that a lot of people in my upbringing had was like, oh, and I think Columbine had a lot to do with this because I think there was, I don't know if it ended up being true or not. It's probably not. But there was like a story that came out of the Columbine shooting where like one of the shooters was like, tell me you don't believe in God. And then this girl was like, no, I believe in God. And then she got shot or whatever. And that just became just a big boner moment for a lot of the people that I grew up with. Were like, I would love to encounter a crazed gunman who tells me to denounce my faith so that I can say no and I can die a martyr for Jesus. Anyway, like that's kind of the same vein. This dude's holding a snake and he's like, prove your salvation's real by holding the snake. And like, no one has any context for that, right? Like this crazy looking dude just comes running out of the forest holding a snake and just like, here, hold this snake. Prove to me that you're saved by the Jesus. And it's like, okay, dude, chill out. But from there, Hensley began holding snake handling services all over rural Tennessee. And to make it more official, he applied to be a Church of God minister in 1914, but there was a slight problem with all of that. He was illiterate. Like he couldn't read. And yet he was going to try to like preach the Bible. And he like tried to explain all of it by saying that he had memorized Bible verses and that God had spoken through him while he preached. So like he didn't technically need to learn how to read the Bible. God was just going to start talking through him and it's going to be fine. That explanation was apparently good enough for the ordination board, and Hensley began organizing revival services at churches throughout Tennessee, which is crazy that that's a thing that could have happened. In 1922, Hensley resigned from the Church of God, citing quote-unquote trouble in the home. He eventually separated from his wife, Amanda, mostly because he had become an alcoholic. After all, Mark 16:18 said that if he drank anything deadly, it wouldn't hurt him. The following year, he was arrested for moonshining and spent 4 months in prison. While on chain gang duty, Hensley was allowed to go to a nearby well for water. Instead, he did what Jesus would have done and escaped into the woods and spent several years on the run, hiding out in the hills before making his way to his sister's home in Ohio. While in Ohio, Hensley met Irene Klunzinger, who was 25 years younger than him at that point. Despite the age difference, the two got married, had 2 kids, and eventually moved down to Kentucky. In 1932, Hensley resumed his snake handling preaching and established a free Pentecostal church in Pineville, Kentucky, where he condemned things like wearing lipstick and playing baseball. Okay. By 1935, Hensley had relocated to St. Charles, Virginia, where he gained notoriety for his fiery sermons and snake handling, with as many as 500 people in attendance at a time. Because again, it's not like there's anything else going on in rural Virginia. So, of course, when some dude's going to show up and he's going to be whipping snakes around, you're going to go watch that. If he wasn't handling snakes, he was actually drinking battery acid and strychnine to continue proving that Mark 16:18 was a totally real verse that people could totally get behind and take literally. And just that phrase of if he drinks anything, what was it? If they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. Crazy. A year later, Hensley was preaching and snake handling in Florida and Georgia, attracting as many as 700 people at a time to his sermons. During a service in Barrow County, Georgia, a man was bitten by one of Hensley's snakes, And Hensley later told reporters that the man had not quite been ready for the quote-unquote demonstrations of power, but predicted the man would make a full recovery. Guess what? He died. So, wrong. Fearing liability and prosecution for this man's death, Hensley fled back to Ohio and then back to Pineville, Kentucky, where he was subsequently arrested for improperly handling snakes. Nice. By 1943, Hensley had separated from Irene and was back in Tennessee. Unfortunately for him, though, snake handling had lost its popularity and churches were teaching a different form of theology than what he supported. Undeterred, Hensley then met Raymond Hayes, who was a young fan of his teachings, who had moved to the Ooltewah area where Hensley had recently returned, back in Tennessee. The two then teamed up and opened the Dolly Pond Church of God with signs following in 1945. A few weeks after opening, a member of the church was bitten by a snake, of course, and then later died. Despite that, members of the church continued to handle snakes, including at the funeral of the man who had been killed by the snake bite. Genius. Hensley played the entire ordeal off as God testing the faith of the congregation and to demonstrate to non-believers that snakes were indeed dangerous as long as you didn't have faith in God. Like, yeah, these snakes, very terrible, very dangerous, unless you're saved, and then God's not going to let them hurt you. That's the rules that's in the Bible. By the 1950s, Hensley had married and divorced for a third time and was living and preaching in Chattanooga. He also began claiming that he had been involved in a mining accident that had initially left him paralyzed for a year, but that he had been miraculously healed. In July 1955, he began preaching at a revival near Alpha, Florida. After 3 weeks without snakes, Hensley brought out a 5-foot snake on July 24th during a service at an abandoned blacksmith shop. After removing the snake from the lard can where he stored it, he wrapped the snake around his neck and then rubbed it on his face as he preached. He then walked amongst the congregation and continued the sermon with the snake before attempting to put it back into the can. But as he placed the snake in the can, the snake bit his wrist. And this wasn't particularly alarming because, and this should not surprise you, Hensley had been bitten as many as 400 times up to that point. However, a few minutes later, Hensley began experiencing severe pain, his arm became severely discovered, and he began vomiting blood. The congregation, including the Calhoun County Sheriff who was in attendance, urged him to seek medical attention. Dude, this is not good. Hensley, however, blamed his pain on a lack of faith in the room. Yeah, I'm fine. You guys just gotta have more faith in God. Your lack of faith is the reason I'm just vomiting blood right now. Well, guess what? Hensley died the following morning, and the Calhoun County judge ruled his death as a suicide. Way to go. Our last story here, this is one of my favorites. In 1998, youth pastor Melvyn Nurse was given the opportunity to preach to the entire congregation at Living Way Christian Fellowship Church International in Jacksonville, Florida. Since he was the youth pastor, all right, he knew he needed to deliver a memorable sermon to earn the respect and adoration of the 250-member adult congregation. And I get it. Like, I always felt like the youth pastor at the church I grew up at, just like anytime he got the chance to do the main service, like no one was really taking him seriously. And it's also because he was doing a lot of like quasi gang signs and like trying to act cool as if he was still preaching to a bunch of teenagers, even though it was adults. And so it didn't really translate, but whatever. Nurse, he gets his opportunity. All right. 250 people. It's a big deal. All right. And so Nurse, for his sermon, chose to talk about sin, classic, and how it could put the congregation in great danger if they continued to sin. And Nurse then made a comparison of sinning to playing Russian roulette. And to emphasize his point, he pulled out a .357 Magnum revolver, first to explain the concept of Russian roulette to anyone who was too sheltered to actually know what that was. And then he inserted a blank round into the revolver, spun the cylinder, as you do in Russian roulette, lifted the gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. Now, in Nurse's mind, the gun would either make an empty click, and it would just be this ooh moment, or The blank would fire, amaze the congregation, and drive his point home. And, he could play dead. Well, ideally, he would have gotten one of the 5 empty slots in the cylinder. But if he did, we wouldn't be talking about him here, would we? No. Instead, he won. He won his little game of Russian roulette, and the gun fired at his head at point blank range. Now, think about this. If it was just a blank round, he would be fine, right? Wrong. That's not how blanks work, right? Blanks are still projectiles. They're still things that you put in. Something still shoots out of a blank round. They're just not made of lead or gunpowder. It's typically just like a condensed piece of cardboard, right? However, if you fire a piece of cardboard at your head from point blank range with something as powerful as a .357 Magnum, it can still do a lot of damage. And guess what happened? Homeboy plays Russian roulette. He gets the blank round. He pulls the trigger. Bam. Loud shot. The force of the gun blast from the blank knocked pieces of Nurse's skull into his brain, causing him to collapse onto the floor. One of the associate preachers in the audience, thinking that this was still all part of the sermon, slowly did walk up to the altar to check on him and was actually alarmed to see blood coming from Nurse's head. Nurse died at the hospital 5 days later.
All done.
All right, men of God in the books. Let us quickly recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, Harold Davidson trying to do some good, trying to be like Jesus and minister to the prostitutes, and he's just weird about it, just real creepy about it. Ultimately got lost everything, had to file bankruptcy, became a street performer, and then while performing some weird Daniel in the Lion's Den thing, a lion bit him in the neck and killed him. What a surprise. Number 2, George Hensley. Listen, hang on, back up. If you go to a church and they're handling snakes and they're just all like, yeah, see this, me holding this snake is a sign that God says I'm saved and that if you can hold this snake, you're saved too. Nah, get out. That's not real. It's not biblical. If Jesus had the ability to be here right now, or at least in those services, to be like, hey, no, that's false representation. I feel like you should have done it because that's real stupid. Anyway, number 3, youth pastors or parents. If, your kid has a youth pastor who likes making real dramatic analogies, like sinning is like playing Russian roulette with your life. Every sin you commit, the next sin you commit could be the end. Just like this gun. Pow! I don't send them to that church. Just don't. Bad advice.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, going back to one story, and that is of serial killer Gerard Schaefer. Not sure why more hasn't been made about this guy. I mean, he's a pretty bad dude. Anyway, we're going to tell his story next week because it's pretty interesting. So come on back for that. Thank you for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
This is a podcast.